Also, one of the things
All right,
that
let me jump in here. We got a lot to talk about today. It's good to see everybody. Sarah, I'm glad that you guys are okay. Moose are really scary. I ran into one on the trails a couple of weeks ago and definitely like screamed like a little girl and ran the direct opposite direction of the moose. I think your technique for dealing with it was a lot better than mine. Well, cool. Thanks for everybody for tuning in. It's nice to see some people coming in here live. That way we're not talking into the void, which sometimes it feels a little bit like we are early on a Friday morning. Yeah, I was kind of hoping that we could really get into these topics. I know I had a couple last minute things in the logs, athletes asking me about what was going on with my CCC training, but maybe I'll talk about that next week. Yeah, for now, I really wanted to talk about the topic of recovery after big ultras and 100 milers. I think this is a really, really, really important topic because I often see the biggest hurdle for athletes in coming back from a race being the mental challenge of the recovery itself. And people often expect the race to be the most difficult part of the experience. And in my experience as a coach, talking about this with Zoe, some of the other coaches, I actually think that the 100 is sometimes the easier part. And it's coping with the recovery afterwards that's really difficult. And in my experience, I have had a number of athletes quit running altogether because they couldn't cope with the recovery process from getting over a big race. So really wanted to jump into this. I know, Sarah, you had some interesting stuff you wanted to say. It sounds like Zoe might agree to disagree, having run 100 miles and knowing what it takes.
I think running 100 miles is pretty dang hard.
Yeah.
Sitting is hard, but hard in a different way.
I think it's not the sitting that's hard. It's the fact that it takes so long to come back.
Yeah.
And the expectation is that after I've done this big race, and we're going to use 100 milers as the example because this
could be a marathon. It could be a 50K, whatever
totally.
It is. You know, like, again, we're not trying to put hundreds on a pedestal. Most people on planet Earth will never run a 100 and will feel good and fine and perfect about themselves and live wonderful, full lives. And that's awesome and great. What this reminds me of is like when I was a little kid and I would want to have sleepovers, my mom would always say, if you're not ready to clean up after the sleepover, you're not ready to have a sleepover. And that's what I think big races are. Like if you're like, anyone can be ready to go have fun, do the big celebration thing. But if you're not ready to clean up after, like in your life, in your mental space, in your, mental health and your physical health, then you're not actually ready to run that race. So if you're not ready to recover for 10 days, then 10 days for 100 miler, 5 to 7 days for a 50.
So I don't want to cut you off, Zoe, but I think having the expectation that it's going to take 10 days to recover for an athlete after 100 is
that's
problem
what I'm
here with this.
Right. Sure. So there's no like set time, like everyone's body recovers differently. And I'm also finding, and something I've worked with Sarah on as well, is like your body's going to respond differently to different races. After I did my 100 in November, I recovered no problem, was right back into speed training, felt great. Like it was awesome. And even though I didn't run all of Western states, I'm still struggling to recover 100%. And like, even as much as I wish I could bargain with my body and say like, hey, I didn't even get the belt buckle. Like, how about you go ahead and like do me a solid and just be recovered now? That's not how things work because I trained my ass off for that race. And I still need to recover, not just from the race, but also from that intensive training I put in.
Yeah. And so, my personal goal as a coach for this conversation is to kind of lower the stigma around the expectation that I think we all have. It's like, okay, 10 to 14 days, we're going to be back in it. But when we approach and complete one of these big stretch goals, it really pushes our systems at a deep cellular level. 100 miles, marathon, whatever it is, it's unique to each individual, but the effort level at a cellular level there's a lot of damage that's done to the body there. And so what happens is, I think athletes sometimes feel like, okay, I've gone through the rest period. I took my 10 days off. I took my, maybe we did a little mini off season after, where I'll have my athletes take like 2 weeks off, and some of that will be like cross training, but they won't run at all. And then the getting back to it is so freaking hard. And often it's like an athlete will feel fine walking around. They'll be fine, like hopping on the bike and cross training, no issues. And then once they start running, oh, my knee hurts.
Yeah.
Oh, my Achilles is bothering me. Like something will come up when the running starts again. And so then it becomes this big practice of patience, as like we have to work through all of those small things. And this is something that I've seen like a dozen times at this point as a coach, been doing this a long time, have coached. And I like the 100-mile example because many people come to Microcosm because they want to run 100 miles. And it seems to be the effort on everybody's mind. And I have seen athletes who, honestly, my assessment is like, okay, this is a big dream goal. It's probably a little too big right now, but it's not necessarily my job to tell you like, this is a stretch. You need to experience this for yourself and go through it in order to understand. I'm going to give you the plan and support you. Then the athlete picks up an appropriate 100, which has a generous cutoff. And they really they do the training, they do a great job. And then like the training gets them to that certain point, and then they are able to mental their way through the rest, and their body just gets destroyed afterwards. And it's 3-4 months of trying to work through all the little niggles and be able to run again. That in that long process, and not realizing like how much they're actually stretching and pushing their body and what that requires. And it's like, I talked to a number of different athletes about this, and even like elites. I talked with Kylie's partner about this recently, who's done a lot of endurance events. And it's like, for some people, it can even be like 6 months to really truly recover from something like this.
And it doesn't make you a better or worse athlete. Like there are some really great athletes that can flip it around, no problem. There's other athletes who are, again, like at the top of this. Like, I think it's interesting if you look at the top 10 men and women of Western states, about half of those athletes will do another big race that summer. And then maybe even like half to 60, almost maybe upwards of 70%, depending, of those athletes do not race again until like maybe like a golden ticket race the next season, because everyone's physiology responds to that big stimulus differently. There are sex differences for sure. Testosterone's a hell of a drug when it comes to recovery from 100s. Your athletic background factors into that a lot. What your training looks like factors into that a lot. Like there's kind of a threshold of like, if you're insufficiently repaired, that recovery is going to be even worse. But if you're like really like sharp and really, really prepared, then again, you have like all the stress from training to process through your system as well. And I think that, again, like don't judge yourself for needing more time. The goal isn't to recover faster. The goal is to figure out how much recovery you need, give your body that, learn and adapt as you go so that you can feel good when you show up to your next race.
100%. Let me turn it over to Sarah, because I know, Sarah, like your personal experience with the recovery process after hundreds can probably, provide like some really good perspective for athletes dealing with something similar.
Yeah, I mean, after my race at Staunton this February, which was 70 miles, but like 22 hours, after that race, I was like, okay, it has pretty much consistently taken me 6 weeks to recover from big events at this point. Like we could look back at Bryce and we can look back at 50-mile efforts I've done. And like, if I really look at when things got good and I was feel like have threes across the board again, it's like about 6 weeks. And then I did Bryce this year and did 60 miles and felt great in like 2 weeks. And that like all of a sudden I had finally had acceptance with needing this long process. And then a race was like, oh, like actually you can feel good now. So that like variability and just listening to your body and trusting it, I think is really important. So I think it's like expectations are just so important. Like I think I do better when it just says rest as opposed to rest or 30 minutes, right? Because I'm going to see that or 30 minutes and then I'm going to try it. And then I'm going to feel bad or, not. And then I also know like, I'm like a very like good day, bad day on my way back to recovery. So I'll like do that 30-minute run. I'll be like, yes, like I totally kicked ass. Like I am feeling good. I'm like ready to get back in it. And I'm like stoked. And then the next day I feel awful. And then I'm telling myself like a totally different story. So I know that pattern now. And we like Zoe and I can work with that pattern and just like reduce expectations for longer. So we just know like, and it's about reframing the why. Like, what is the why behind the period of time after a race? The why is recovery. So everything that I'm doing in that time is not about fitness. It's not about like getting back. It's not about my next race. It's about recovering. And so really trying to have that focus is helpful. But I think like I'll ask my athletes, like, does it feel better for me to just put rest in? Does it feel better for me to plan out the next couple of weeks? Like what feels good? Because some athletes are going to feel like an option or something's in the log that's like an obligation. And some will understand that, hey, like I trust you to listen to your body and that's an option. But if your body wants rest, then rest. And so, yeah, your body is the guide for that. I would say like, it's not just physical stuff too. Like definitely the biggest fights that my husband and I have been in the weeks after big efforts. Like emotionally, I'm super sensitive and things like that. And so again, expectations, like we now talk about that and we like definitely don't have big conversations in the few weeks after a race. And like, we're building in, we know that I just need some more self-care time and things like that. And so just paying attention, noticing patterns for yourself. And yeah, just being focused on that rest and realistic expectations or no expectations.
Yeah, I think you make some really great points there, Sarah. I know we've talked so much about expectations, managing expectations. And I think sometimes with this stuff in particular, when an athlete puts that, big dream goal on the, finally gets to put that big dream goal on the plan. They've done the work, the hard work, they've made the steps, they've done the like intermediate goals, they've put their action steps into place. They've gotten themselves to the point where it's now time, like where that big goal is like an appropriate stretch. And then they go for it, they do the training and they complete the goal. And the expectation, I think very naturally is like, well, the hard part's over. And there is so much work to be done in the recovery process that I think we often have the expectation like, okay, this is going to be pretty easy. Like I just did, my 100-miler, I did my 100K, I did my marathon, whatever it is. Like I did that thing that I came here, hoping to eventually get to. I put the work in a year, 2 years, 3 years, however long that it takes. And then like, oh my God, it's so hard to recover from this. I'm on that roller coaster, and that roller coaster, I'll normalize what you've gone through because I have seen that with so many athletes. And it's the athletes who give themselves permission to work through that process that then go on to have a lot of success in running. And it's the athletes who struggle with that and then make that a referendum on who they are, their accomplishments, what kind of athlete they are, that oftentimes ultimately quit. And it's really hard as a coach to see that because you can't, I can't like change somebody's mind. I can only give them support in those moments and say, hey, this is normal. This is what happens. You have to be willing to work through this for however many months that it takes. And I, having had friends that have run like races like Western States and been crushed for like a year by it. And like, even after great performances, or, listening to podcasts with other great athletes who have like gone through similar things at their first 100 or whatever. I think for me, that's like, okay, I'm starting to see some patterns here. This is actually something that's really common. It's not happening with just, mid-pack athletes. It's not happening with, it's happening at every level of the sport. And so, I think having like almost a roadmap or a framework for dealing with the recovery process is going to be necessary, I think, for a lot of athletes, like as we move forward. And because we like ultimately want that big dream goal that pushes us to be the impetus for something else. We don't want it to be the end of everything, the end all be all. It's not like an actual finish line. It's just like representative of part of the journey. It should just be a guidepost that allows you to then find something else and move forward. So that way you can ultimately figure out what your potential is. Your potential is never just one race, in my mind.
No, there is no one race, right? Like, but yeah, that's not what life is. There's no teleology. There's no meaning. It's just chaos. Keep putting fun chaos on your training plan. Make it worthwhile.
Yeah. So I guess if you're maybe one of those athletes who's kind of in a funk right now, or, Sarah brought up some really great points about developing awareness around like how she recovers. I think this is particularly important for athletes who like race very consistently during the season, or put forth a lot of like build up goals, like intermediate goals, B or C goals that help them to then like step up to their like big A race of the season. If you know how you recover, you can make better decisions around your training. I'll use one example from my own training. It takes me a while to recover from like a 40 plus mile race. It's generally gonna take me a month to recover if I go very hard at that race. That's kind of been my experience over the last 4 or 5 years. I'm racing CCC. I needed to get a big effort in before the race. My coach wanted me to run a 50 miler because CCC is like a 12-hour race. Great. Well, knowing what I know about how long it takes me to recover, especially mentally recover, I put that race the farthest out that he recommended. Period. I didn't find the perfect race. I found the race that worked, that was the farthest out, that contributed to me leading up to CCC and gave me the most opportunity to recover. I've been very lucky that I've recovered quickly, but that was not the expectation. Like the expectation was like, maybe next week I'll be recovered from that race and really be training well, and I'll get a few weeks in before CCC. That's not what's happening, fortunately, but like, that's what I was expecting based on past history, based on past experience. And when we allow ourselves to work through the recovery process, we get all of that data about ourselves that we can then use to inform our training, talk with our coach about it as we move forward. And it just raises the level of everything afterwards. So, that's why I really wanted to have this conversation. I want to encourage anybody who's struggling to recover after a race to lean in and just embrace that learning process as much as it sucks. And believe me, I've been there.
It sucks
it's
less
really
than OTS.
Hard. Yes, it does. And it's worth it once you get through it. I know Sarah has kind of, I think it was what was the race that Sarah did? And she had some trouble recovering after. It was like a year ago or something.
I wouldn't say trouble. It's like, I think she ran Bryce over a year ago, and her body recovered fine within the time that it needed to recover, And I think that once we were like, oh yeah, you're like you need 6 weeks for this recovery, like boom, then she was, great, faster, fitter than ever coming back. And I think that, something that's at least been helpful for me is like, am I struggling to recover? Like, is there actually something going on? Or is the struggle actually just because I'm foisting an external expectation on the recovery? So like, And I also think something that's been helpful for me is reframing for athletes too, is like, oh, it's not like I'm really taking downtime. This is adaptation time. And if you come back too fast, too quick, you're undermining any potential adaptation from the race. You're actually shortchanging how much benefit you get from that effort by coming back too fast. So giving your body the time it needs, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, like, you know, we don't even need to put a number on it. Like, I think that it becomes like a recovery issue. Like, again, if there's like persistent kind of like, you know, things that start to get into the realm of like adrenal fatigue, sleep disruption, soft tissue injury, those are things where I'm like, oh, that's like not normal. That's your body saying like, there's maybe an acute issue going on. But if you're just kind of like not feeling 100%, like, again, if it takes like months and months and months, that's probably a sign of a deeper issue. We'd want to really check on like nutrition, sleep, some lifestyle and health things. But like, yeah, if it takes you 6 weeks to recover from 100, that's like real normal. That's so far in, I think that just like culturally, most of the people that like we see on Instagram are the people that are like, I just ran Hard Rock and now I'm doing high lows a week later. It's so great. And it's like, that's not my body.
I
Thank
know.
you.
And like the Western States crew who always tries to turn it around for UTMB races, I just like
And
put
like
my
some
head down and
people,
shake it. I'm
some
like,
people
what are you thinking?
can, and you know, like
Very
even,
few people can.
and Jim
Almost
Walmsley
nobody can. They
like,
all
well,
DNF.
Emily Hawgood, Beth Pascal, like
A
actually
couple
Beth
people.
Pascal DNF. Emily Hawgood did it really well.
A couple
Maybe
people. And
Brittany
if I
Peterson.
don't think it's a good idea to, you know, like highlight outliers.
Yeah,
Like,
well,
what's the
I think,
majority
you
of
know,
people doing?
let outliers exist, but don't overemphasize that in your brain, because there's going to be outliers on the other end of the spectrum. Let's interrogate why our brain gravitates towards the narrative that says like, push your body, do the most always, recover. You're like, oh yeah, great. I was raised in America. Obviously, I'm like built to believe that the most like best thing to do is go full metal Goggins and sign up for 300s in a summer.
Goes kind of back to the post. I hope everybody saw it that Sarah made on social media on behalf of Microcosm yesterday.
Yeah.
About being enough, making training decisions from a place of enough. And that the path is linear, but it doesn't feel linear. Might be the only part of training and racing that's linear, is that you're enough no matter what, always, every day. This same. Like, at least gives me some peace in my heart. Let's segue over to this, because I think these are really related topics. But when we're struggling with our training, maybe struggling with our recovery, it's important to be flexible with our training, with our schedules. And so this has actually been something that's no longer at a recent call, but in the past, I shared about how I had become more flexible with my training over time, and that I've learned some interesting stuff about my experiences through that I've been kind of taking to my coaching with my athletes. I wanted to start off, Kylie, by bringing it to you, because I know you had a lot to say about this, but I think it's really related to the conversation that we've already been having.
Well, I don't know if I have a lot to say, but I guess when I take an approach with my athletes, I always want to consider, you know, their longevity in sport and then their enjoyment of it as well. And I do work, for some reason, I tend to work with athletes that have had an injury history. And I feel like I do a pretty good job of maybe trying to combine activities that will give them fitness, but maybe not overdo the stress on their bodies. And I think it goes back, you're right, that it does tie into this idea of like, no two athletes are going to be the same. And so trying to figure out what's going to work best for that person, volume wise running, and then maybe utilizing other kind of cross training activities could be beneficial. I think it's important to also keep in mind, though, that we've talked about this before, that we really want people to be able to do a certain amount of training for when you're training for certain events. So I'm always trying to like emphasize that with athletes, that we do need to do a certain amount of run training, because this is a running race. And then trying to figure out, what else can we do to maybe help you volume wise, get things increased, or like I was saying, like alternative activities. Sometimes I will build them in because athletes maybe have a family and they want to they want to ride their bike or something as part of their thing. And so trying to like think of the person too, versus like, I'm just like rah, 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 like focused on the running like 24/7. And I think even in my own personal running, like I always used to be like, oh, strictly running, like I can't do anything else. And so trying to, I think, actually have some more of that balance has been really good for just like diversifying and like keeping things interesting and preventing me, because I've dealt with like a couple of bouts of injury, like preventing me from overdoing it and pushing me over the edge. So I try to approach it similarly with my athletes.
Yeah, thank you, Kylie. I think that's so important. It's just some things to highlight there that I heard was really coaching to the individual, and thinking about like the context of their life, and making coaching calls based on that. And I think that is really important, because as coaches, like we all have methodology to draw from, protocol to draw from. But that stuff is only worth so much as the individual, that you're coaching can kind of assimilate that into their training practice. Ultimately, the athlete is the one that has to do the work. The coach doesn't do the work. The coach provides the support and the plan. And so sometimes not every athlete can, it would be great for me to make my job easier, but not every athlete is able to like have this, do the same thing as another athlete. And so, something that I think like about when I think about like flexibility with the plan, or just flexibility in general, it's like, how can we reiterate things like rest, or, when you have these optional training things where, the athlete doesn't feel like that's an obligation, like it truly is optional, and have flexibility there, like Sarah mentioned earlier. And I know that's something for me, when I have, and we talked about this on previous calls, but it's like, if my training is 10 to 12 miles, I think 12 miles, I don't think 10 miles. And so like, and I know so many athletes think that way. And it's taken me a long time to think 10 to 12, and that could be 9.5 even, or 9, or it could be 13 if I'm having a great day. And so like that kind of flexibility in being like, okay, good training is doing the least you can do to provoke adaptation. And so if you can do 12, that's great. But if you're going to get the same stimulus from doing 10, and you're going to finish the run feeling better mentally, if you're going to finish the run feeling really good and stoked for the next run, like I'm already hearing two things in my mind that like point me to just being like, oh, 10 is probably more advantageous than going for all 12. Or like, and this works the same way if you're one of my athletes who is like on a 1 to 2 mile range, or a 2 to 4 mile range, whatever it is. Being able to exercise that flexibility and to feel good, like that's enough. And go ahead, Zoe. I know you want to say something.
And not even just that flexibility, but also discernment, because like, again, like if you're given the range 6 to 8, a lot of times I'll have athletes say, sorry, I only did 6 today. And like, they'll feel like they need to justify it. Like, we don't need to see that. Like, the biggest skill as an athlete is being able to discern what stress load is most productive for you. Like usually as a coach, like, yes, we are there to help give general guides, but I am a huge fan of ranges for athletes that works for and doesn't drive mentally crazy. And like for some people, like that's like, we all have different brains. If the range isn't your jam, that's fine. Knowing that about yourself and communicating that to your coach is true mental toughness, and we love to see it. But if you're forcing out those extra 2 miles because you feel like you have to, like, again, you're actually shortchanging yourself the adaptations you need. Doing less and feeling good will help your body adapt to that stress better than doing more and feeling tired, feeling run down. Like always doing the most is an actually very poor way of spurring adaptations, short and long term, really. So I think it's just always really important to just say, like, what's the why behind why we do this? And the why is to prioritize the actual adaptation. Your body doesn't know miles, it knows stress, and we have to redistribute accordingly. And I think that a lot of times I'll see athletes that feel bad because they need to do the lower end or they need to reduce and they feel like it's not enough. And they're like, oh, everyone's getting faster and fitter. But the reality is like, you can only handle so much stress as a human being, and like, not like trying to like in your head have the magical thinking of like, what if I just did the same amount of volume or more volume and had that life stress? Like that's truly not an option. So you need to really, really work on dismantling that narrative of like, well, what if I could do more in your head? Because that's just physically not a reality, even though it like seems like it might seem like it's an option, but it's truly not. And so being able to really say like, what's the why behind why I'm running 6 miles as opposed to 8 miles today? It's because I know and trust that doing 6 and feeling good will lead to better adaptations than doing 8 and forcing it out and feeling run down and always feeling like I have to do the most and I have to jump higher and higher. That's not going to lead to you being a faster, fitter athlete long term.
And I think as you know, as coaches, we all have those athletes and I personally can see a lot of that in myself. Sorry, we need to mute that person. I can see a lot of those habits in myself, you know, of wanting to do more. And often, you know, that comes from, you know, whatever our history is as people, how we were brought up and things like that. And we're reading the Do Hard Things book by Steve Magnus, some really good stuff in there. But my question for the coaches, and we can maybe do a little roundtable around this, but you know, when we're exercising flexibility with our athletes and knowing that, you know, at least for me, I'm not a huge fan of makeup runs. I'm a big fan of extra rest, but I've gotten more flexible with that kind of way of thinking with certain athletes who have more difficult schedules, where I might give an option for making up a few miles very short on a Friday or something. Because if that athlete doesn't, you know, get that makeup run in, you know, they'll end up always running 3 or 4 times a week and they'll never run 5 times a week. I'm curious kind of what you guys think about that, how you exercise flexibility within an individual week of training. Yeah, Kristen, I haven't heard from you yet today, or Drew. Yeah, Kristen, why don't you go first? I'm curious just like what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I was actually the same way for a long time, TJ, where I was like, no makeup runs, you know. And I think in a lot of cases, in 95% of cases, like no makeup runs, lean into recovery, jump back into consistent training the next day or on Monday, whatever it is based on the training, and based on the athlete. But I do have a few athletes who have just crazy busy schedules. And, you know, it got to the point where it's like, okay, we're going to add in like an optional makeup run here, or we're going to like do a surprise rest day because life happens. And we're just going to shift everything a day ahead so that you still get those, like you get the speed workout, you get the long run, you know, and then with the caveat in there to like rest intentionally, because you're, you know, like there's a little bit more volume now. So you have to be very careful about nutrition and recovery, and make sure that you're resting with intention. So definitely have loosened my grip on that a little bit. And I think that it's better for the athletes actually with the really busy schedules.
I've got a couple athletes that are similar, where their careers or their family life really are and really should be more important than just whatever, you know, event they're training for. So what I like to do with those athletes is I like to actually write in flex days where we're going to run 5 days in the 7-day span. You're going to take 2 days off. And those 2 days off can be flexed in or out depending on the need or desire. So long as I always tell them, like, you never have like back-to-back hard runs at this point in training. So I don't want you to do like a speed workout the day after you did your long run, for example. But really trying to make sure that that they've got the option. They know ahead of time, like, I've got to run 5 days this week. I don't know what this week will entail, but it feels comfortable. It makes them feel less anxious about their work schedules and their family lives. And that just seems to have worked out really well for them.
Yeah, awesome. I love what both of you guys had to say. Sarah, do you want to jump in on this?
I think I'm more, it's like really athlete specific, and like, I definitely want to have like a really solid base or like a really good chunk of consistency before I'm doing any of that. So like, not going to probably change, not going to be as flexible with newer athletes, and am more flexible with athletes who I've been working with longer, and I know they can handle the flexibility, or they can handle more stress or less stress in a given week. So I'm still sort of there with it. Like, I am flexible, but I want to see that base for a little bit longer first.
Yeah, totally agree. Like, especially with injury prone athletes or like really high life stress athletes, I'm like, yeah, dog, we're going to rest. Like, we're not going to try to get in 4 extra miles for like no real reason. And a frame that I always like to give athletes is that training isn't filling a mileage bucket. You're building a wall, and you're not just trying to reach like a certain, like, oh, got to fill out that Strava graph every week. You're trying to put certain stress loads in certain places at certain times. And the deeper your base is, the deeper your history is, the more resilient and durable you are, and the more dialed you are on sleep and nutrition, the more flexibility you have with that. But if you're not nailing your nutrition, you're not sleeping, you're not managing stress very well, then like, we're really like, we have to fit the training into that context. We can't fit that context into the training.
Gosh, you guys, every single one of you guys has just like totally nailed this. I agree 100%. I think, like, just to follow up on it a little bit, we require 1 year minimum to work with us. And that's because these processes take shape over a long period of time. Like Sarah said, like building a rapport with an athlete, getting to know truly what their kind of life context is, and then how the training is really fitting into that isn't something that happens in one conversation. It happens over a lot of check-ins over many, many months. And ideally, and I've said it before, but if like we could require a 3-year minimum, if that made sense as a business, I would do that, because it's like, oh my God, when I've put in like 2 or 3 years of training, wow, do I have like all of this flexibility? Like, my coach really knows me now, like they understand how I respond to certain situations. I know myself better and how I respond to these situations, and I can make better decisions about my training and then get all this flexibility back. And I think particularly, like, we've talked a lot about FOMO and missing out on friends' adventures. And, as training athletes who have schedules and are working towards real goals, when we see athletes who are just winging it and going off the cuff and doing this mountain bike ride here and this 30-mile adventure run here, and they're not doing the same thing as us, they're not engaged in the same thing at all as us, it can be really challenging. But when you've put the time in over a few years and you've developed that wall, like Zoe mentioned, you do get back the flexibility to jump into something, because you've put forth all of that effort. You've made those investments all along. And we know that if we go off plan a few times, it's not going to affect the overall architecture of what we're doing and where we're going. It's only for athletes who don't have training history, who don't have consistency in that history of consistency, and are really new to the process, where it's more important to be rigid in those moments, because we need to create that foundation in order to have flexibility on top of it. I think there are certain situations in my own coaching with athletes who are really busy, my doctors, my nurses, where, we have to be more flexible because of the very challenging nature of the schedules and those 10, 12-hour shifts and things like that. But, outside of that, again, I tend to like lean a little bit more on Sarah's side, where it's like, let's develop our relationship first. Let me get to know you better so I can make more educated decisions about your training. But with the caveat that, like, if you miss a run, but you're feeling good, maybe adding in that flex day can be really helpful. Yeah. Kylie, I didn't mean to gloss over you. I wonder if you've got any kind of perspective on this.
I mean, I kind of said what I do at the beginning of the question. I
Oh,
went at
right.
the beginning, remember? I was like, I
That's right.
started it off and then people kind of went from there. So
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for that. Let's turn to nutrition then, now that I've got you here. A few weeks back, I had an athlete ask about the importance around diversifying carbs in training. And they were wondering like how we can identify the different types of carbohydrates that make up like our race fuel, and if there are different ways that gets absorbed, and should we be focusing on different kinds of carbs during performance and recovery?
yeah, so I guess to start out, there is typically a limit on the amount of certain types of carbs that you can consume every hour during your activity. And when we're looking at, I guess let's start out with the 4 different types that are typically found in sports nutrition products or that you might find in other food products. So fructose is one, glucose, then we have sucrose, which is actually a combination of glucose and fructose. And then we have maltodextrin, which is kind of a weird, like branched glucose type molecule. And so when we're looking at, rates of absorption, glucose itself is absorbed like really quickly. So it's going to give you a quick burst of energy. It's best used if you are doing higher intensity sessions. And you can absorb higher amounts of it every hour typically. So right now they're still kind of studying this idea of like pushing 100 over 90 grams of carbs per hour. So I'm going to go off of like, we're not entirely sure what that quote limit is right now. But for the average person, I wouldn't recommend pushing over 90 grams of carbs per hour, unless you've maybe been running for a while or that you have a pretty strong system. The reason why I bring that up is because then when we break it down into these different types of sugars, we know that there's kind of a limit on those too, because there are different sugar transporters in our small intestine that allow for the molecules to go through. So we've got a glucose transporter and then we have a fructose transporter, and the glucose transporter, typically we have more of those. And then with fructose is just a much slower processed molecule because it has to be metabolized in the liver first. And then there do tend to be a little bit less in the way of transporters in the small intestine. So the important thing to remember is when you're choosing your products with glucose and fructose, you don't typically want to have more fructose than glucose. And where I see that become an issue is when athletes have a drink mix that might have fructose in it, and then they're using gels or dried fruit or products like Spring Energy, which fruit is going to have a high percentage of fructose in it. So any Spring Energy or Muir Energy, etc., will have quite a bit of fructose in it. So I always recommend, like, it's really hard to estimate how many grams of fructose or glucose is in something, but I recommend not using like 2 products within the same hour that contain fructose, just to kind of be safe. You can do it if you're practicing it, and then sometimes if people want to go the extra mile, they might like contact Morton or something and see like if they'll give you the amount of fructose in the product. But it can be difficult to kind of figure that out unless you do some investigative work. And when we look at grams
sorry, this is kind of like convoluted, but I'm trying to put it together. When we look at grams of glucose to fructose per hour, so we're looking at that 90 grams total. And then when we break that down, glucose, we were looking about 60 grams per hour, and then fructose 30 grams per hour max. So the combination of those two would equal 90. I would say for the majority of athletes that I work with a lot, most of them are not even consuming near 90 grams an hour. And so say you were to consume a drink mix where you're only getting like 20 grams of carbs an hour from the drink mix, and then your gel also only has 20 grams of carbs in it. So that's 40 grams of carbs. Then you might not need to be as concerned about like, does my gel have fructose and my drink mix have fructose? Because you're not even consuming that much carbohydrate overall. So this is where like trying to use your best judgment on like, I guess I would say if you're consuming a high amount of carbohydrate per hour, you want to be more careful with the products that you're using with glucose fructose. Whereas if you're not consuming as much carb per hour, I'd say, you know, under 60 grams per hour, then the two products could potentially contain fructose. And then, so sucrose is a glucose fructose molecule, and it also is processed pretty quickly in the body and can raise and drop blood sugars pretty quickly. So I want to make sure I address those 4 types of sugars that I was talking about. And then maltodextrin is kind of this like branched chain glucose molecule, and some companies claim that it is digested and absorbed a little bit more slowly in the small intestine, and can reduce the risk of GI distress. But I've actually worked with quite a few athletes where maltodextrin has caused them stomach issues, because if you get overconfident with it, you can actually overwhelm the system. With maltodextrin, I suggest like just being careful with it. The reason why people would say that it's, you know, absorbed a little bit more slowly and maybe you can take in more of it, is because when we look at, I'm trying not to get too scientific here, when we look at the kind of percentage of like particles in our small intestine, think to like high school biology here. We want to kind of have this like fluid balance going on. And if we have too many particles on the inside of our small intestine, it causes a concentration gradient difference, in which case, if we have too many particles on the inside, we draw water from our bloodstream and we can actually dehydrate ourselves and cause gas, bloating, GI issues. So with maltodextrin, because it's branched, it actually has a lower osmolality, or like less particle size, because it's a branched molecule. And so it's actually not causing maybe the same like concentration gradient difference in the small intestine. Sorry if that was confusing, but I'm just trying to like give a general overview of like these types of sugars, and then like what to look out for and how to figure out what you would want to use for your fueling plan. Main takeaways would be just try not to consume too much fructose when you are consuming your products or putting together your fueling plan. And I just see a lot of people like using dried fruit, or, you know, they're like dates and whatever. And I'm like, okay, well, if you have dates and you have a drink mix that has fructose in it, like probably not going to be a good choice in my mind. So just kind of minimizing your risks if possible with that, and being on the safe side and doing more glucose and sugar.
That's awesome. I don't think we've really discussed the impacts of too much fructose on previous calls. And if we have, forgive me for not fully digesting that information. But again, Kylie, just briefly for athletes, what is kind of like the general tolerance for fructose that an athlete can handle per hour? How many grams of carbs of fructose
So it would
before
be,
maybe we're going to get in
if we take the
trouble?
90 as the standard, as the max standard, it'd be a 2-to-1 ratio of glucose to fructose. So 60 grams of glucose and 30 grams of fructose. But it's hard to know like how to, they don't list the grams of fructose on a product. So that's why I say like minimize risk by maybe choosing products that maybe don't have a lot of fructose in them, or one of your products has fructose, the other one doesn't, so trying to maybe make those kind of decisions. And then there's a question from Chelsea that said, have you had much experience with athletes consuming SIS gels? Are they better on the stomach because of the isotonic formula? So that's kind of what I was getting back to, or I was talking about earlier, like the osmolality. So isotonic means like the same osmolality as the blood. So technically the idea would be that you are taking in this formula and that it's not going to cause any kind of like fluid imbalance or concentration gradient imbalance issue. The problem is people typically aren't just taking in an SIS gel. They might be taking in like other hydration mix, or maybe they're like, oh, it's isotonic, I'll take 2 gels, or like, they're maybe not thinking about that sort of thing. Yes, like I would say that's the idea, but there are other companies too that make more of like the isotonic formulas that are kind of advertising that they don't cause as much stomach distress. I still think that you should try the product first, because actually SIS gels have some sugar alcohols. Some of them have had sugar alcohols in them, which is not good for GI distress. So there are other things maybe in them that we might not want.
Oh my gosh.
It's almost like you shouldn't believe any marketing claims and should try everything for yourself many times over in practice, no matter what.
What is the perfect fuel? That's what I'm still wondering. Is it Morton? I think maybe it is.
I mean, perfect
Morton
fuel, again, like
is-
we all have different systems too, right? Like,
I
will
I'm
say
just making a
Morton,
shameless
Yeah.
plug for Morton, who is not my sponsor.
but Morton is actually, so it's a hydrogel. It is a hydrogel technology, which means that technically you shouldn't have to take it with fluids, where a lot of other gels you might want to consider taking it with fluids because it could cause stomach distress. So I will say they do use a different technology for their gels.
All about high-tech gels.
Yeah.
That's why
you
they're
wear dried fruit. Whenever I have athletes that are like, and I ate 12 ounces of dried mango on this run, I'm always like, what the fuck? Like, whoa.
Whoa, kid-friendly here, Zoe. Well, thanks, Kylie. I think that was really, really helpful.
It was kind of a
Particularly
lot.
getting-
It was kind of like convoluted. I wasn't sure how to approach it, which I don't know if I did the best job of organizing it, but
No, and I
the
think that,
information
like,
is there. So
totally. And like broad strokes, know what's in your gels, have a plan, put intention and forethought into your fueling plan. And if this is overwhelming and scary, get in touch with a professional.
Totally. And every athlete that I've advocated to work with Kylie has put in the work and has had so much success as a result of that. It is like literally a game changer when you figure out what you need and then get a plan together for how to execute.
Yeah, I'm just going to shout out Megan because she's on the call. She's like doubled the amount of fuel she takes in during races and hasn't been off a podium since. So,
yeah,
like,
hell yeah, Megan.
give it a shot.
That's so awesome.
that's awesome.
Shout out to food, the real MVP of running.
Well, thanks, guys. Maybe we'll call it with that. I think this has been a pretty full discussion. Getting into that race recovery, talking about flexibility, and then, of course, always nutrition. That's the hot topic of always, I think. Can't ever get a call in without thinking something about nutrition.
Carb girl summer.
Yeah, seriously. We will, we'll be back next Friday. We got a call coming up on communication. So I hope to see you guys there. And
Ooh.
yeah, if you're training this weekend, eat a lot of gels. Maybe don't eat too much fructose.
Yeah. Not fructose girl summer.
Yeah. I got to check my scratch. All right. I'm going to do that right now. See you guys. Have a good weekend. Thanks.